Okay, can we start? Can we start? Okay, please, everyone. If I talk low, please tell me because I'm a little... So, hi, Dzodzi. My name is Bruna. I'm a student here at University Federal of IBC, and would like to do some questions for you. So, Professor Dzodzi, in your opinion, how the fact that the social science and international relations were mostly formulated by men affected the theories that we learn today? And do you believe that this fact is changing?
First of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's always a pleasure to come to your university with its progressive character. It's always inspiring to see how engaged students are in this place and in the study of Africa in particular. You asked a question about the social sciences and international relations and the fact that they were formulated by men. I would say that the social sciences and international relations have two problems. One is the fact that they were formulated by Western scholars and in a period when many countries in the South were colonized. And secondly, the fact that these Western scholars were mostly men. So I think there's a double problem. There's a problem of the fact that this is colonial knowledge systems, and also the fact that this is androcentric in its biases. And obviously that affects, one, what is thought of as critical in the social sciences, two, what's studied, what's researched, and three, the fact that most of the researchers are men. And you can see it in the store of knowledge that has been produced about issues that interest men and what's considered large. Often we are told that the social sciences have to be interested in the larger picture. And you find that there are some areas of life which we do not see much of within the social sciences. And worst of all, when new scholarship from the South and from Southern women, it's put out there, it's often ignored. We find ourselves reading everything that Western scholars write in order to work our way through it. They very rarely have the benefit of reading what we are writing. One, because most of the outlets, the journals that are considered to be read and so on, are journals controlled by Western scholars and their institutions. And many of the things that we research and write are often not published. So there's not quite the kind of scientific dialogue that should take place going on. So you find that there's a monologue which is controlled by Western scholarship, and many of us are playing catch-up, and our contribution to the store of knowledge is often not known and also not recognized. And you were asking whether this has changed. Well, it's changing insofar as within the South, there's more confidence in Southern scholarship, and you can see it in Latin America, in Asia, and in Africa. You see many universities beginning to produce their own journals and so on. But the context is still quite unequal, and in fact, in many of these countries in the South, journals from the North are more respected. Often a scholar's portfolio is respected if they are seen to have published in the top journals in the North. And we do not value our own journals in the same way as we value journals from the North. So there's a contest and a pushback going on, but there's a lot to be done to change the situation.
Okay, thanks. The second question, based on what you have seen and studied, do you believe that the colonization period still has an impact on the contemporary international relations and our world?
Yes, I would say that the colonial period is still with us in all sorts of ways, because we have to understand the colonial period as a certain period, a stage in a long-range relationship between the colonized countries and the colonizer countries. And these relationships did not change because colonized countries gained independence in the 60s and 70s. It just changed the particular character of the relationships. And some people in Africa have called it the flag and anthem independence, because now you ostensibly have your own state with a flag and an anthem, and you are supposed to be in charge of your affairs. But international relations do not operate in that way. They are systemic and they are of long duration, and colonialism has cast a very long shadow on the post-colonial period. And if we see it in economic relations around the world, if you look at the global order, globalization, who the players are, the fact that the world's economy is controlled by transnational corporations, mostly based in the West. If you look at the poverty of countries, the rich countries are the countries that used to colonize others and so on. You will see immediately that colonization aftermath is still something that basically influences how we live in the present and the fortunes of people who live in countries that used to be colonized.
Okay, thanks. So the third question. What is the biggest challenge you have identified about the areas of gender and feminism in Africa, according to the period you were deputy head of the Center of Gender Studies and Advocacy at the University of Ghana?
That's a very involved question. I think in that question is a desire to understand what challenges women in Africa, for example, face as women who live in male-dominated societies. And secondly, how these challenges manifest themselves in a place like the University of Ghana. So I want to start with the first one. The point is that in most societies on this globe, there are gender inequalities. Gender relations are not the only social relations that we have in our various countries. There are relations between classes, there are relations between the genders, there are relations between regions and so on. But most often, all these relations intersect and they deliver a certain set of social relations to all people. And we find that women are at the receiving end of a lot of challenges in society. So if you look at the economy, the majority of poor people happen to be women. Women experience their poverty in very gendered ways. It's not the same as men. If you look at social relations, you can see that societies are dominated by men. They are seen as the natural leaders of households, of communities, and of governments. And if you look at the politics, you can see the same gender inequalities. And what's interesting about these gender inequalities is that they are interdependent. So your disadvantages in politics play themselves out in the economy and play themselves out in social life and vice versa. And you will find that many times if you tackle the problem at the level of the social, let's say that people think if you educate a woman, you improve her life chances. It's true that if women get an education, their life chances are vastly improved. But if you do not change the system of labor relations, education will not deliver what it should deliver. And so because these problems are highly interdependent, they reinforce each other. So you find that there are some really persistent problems. There are improvements, but those persistent problems always put a brake on the improvement. So I'll say that you can see gender inequalities in all aspects of life, but you can also see a very vibrant society in which women have a lot of agency. In many parts of Africa, women can own their own businesses. They can go out to work, they can go to school, they can form relations. They have the space in which to operate, as long as they keep within the confines of patriarchal society. If you think about gender issues in a university like the University of Ghana, you see that the University of Ghana is a microcosm of African society and also of Ghanaian society. So the professorate in the university is dominated by men, but most of the professors are men. And many of the women who work in the professorate are junior scholars. And you find the same thing with students, although we almost have parity at the undergraduate level. Once you move to postgraduate education, you find that there are many more men than there are women in postgraduate education. If you look at the sciences, there are much fewer women in the sciences. If you look at the bureaucracy, the administrators, you find that the majority of senior administrators are men. So we have the kinds of gender inequalities in other institutions within the university. And for a center for gender studies like my own, one of our biggest challenges was that the universities did not recognize themselves as gender unequal spaces. The university's concept of itself is that it's a neutral space, and we all come to it as scholars, and it doesn't matter whether we are men or women. And this disembodied view of humans dominates the way the university operates. And it has taken quite some work for a center like my own to point to the fact that the university is an institution, and that it has its own cultures, and that those cultures are gendered, and that they disadvantage women. So that's something that we worked very hard to do. So for example, we identified the problem of sexual harassment. Before the Gender Studies Center was established, there was no policy on sexual harassment. Through our work, we managed to get the university to pass a policy against sexual harassment. So we made a bit of progress with some of the issues facing students and scholars in the university. However, the university remains a gender unequal space, and I think will remain that way for a long time to come.
Okay, interesting. Thanks. So, what are the actions and how important is the African Union in the discussion of the themes gender, women access to land, and development in the African continent?
The African Union, as you know, is a very important body in Africa. Africa has over 54 countries, so Africa is not a country, it's a continent, and each of these countries faces particular problems and because they have particular histories and trajectories and so on. Basically, catalyzing a certain view of Africa as a common space where problems are solved by Africans themselves, and therefore, whatever it does, because heads of states meet as equals, whether or not their countries are large or small, whether they have poor or rich countries, they meet as equals and try and fashion out solutions to some of the most endemic problems facing the African continent, whether it's poverty, whether it's conflict and insecurity, and so on and so forth. And so when they do that, they first of all improve their influence in the world. If they do it well, they improve their influence in the world, because then African countries can have a common position in a global order which does not favor Africa. Now, this is not a perfect system, because the African Union is a collection of mostly male presidents, and there are very few women of influence within the power structures of the African Union. However, the African Union is one of these bodies which has taken gender inequalities as something to deal with. First of all, there was a solemn declaration made by African presidents that they wanted to see women realize themselves, deal with gender inequalities, and become full citizens of Africa. There have been other instruments which African leaders have signed on to in order to promote the situation of women. And these instruments are on paper so far, and no country can be forced to apply them. But at the same time, they have moral force. And activists within African countries are able to point to them and sometimes call their governments to order. It also provides a space to compare what countries are doing, to be able to shame the countries that are not doing well, and to encourage them to do better about certain provisions around gender inequalities. And so basically it's a good space. It's a force for good when it comes to the fight for gender inequalities, but it's not perfect, one, and secondly, it's not the answer to dealing with gender inequalities in Africa. It's just one level at which people struggle for gender equality. They have to do a lot more work in their own countries and within their own communities as well.
Okay, thanks. So, can you tell us about the advances and obstacles that the Ghana's National Development Planning Commission has been facing due to the international political and economic crisis?
It's a very interesting question. I was a member of the National Development Planning Commission for 2 years. And in this period, we're doing something interesting, which was to draw up a 40-year, a long-term plan, development plan for Ghana, a 40-year plan. And the rationale was that Ghana is 60. Ghana has been independent for 60 years. So we wanted to draw up a plan which would be implemented until Ghana turned 100. And we were doing this plan against a very difficult global situation. And as you know, in 2008, we had the international financial crisis, which was a multi-layered crisis. It was a crisis of energy, of finance, of food. And this was also in the aftermath of over 30 years of structural adjustment programs in Africa and the world, in which people wanted to allow the market to decide everything. Economic policy, social policy, everything was to be left to the market. And market ideologies have become very dominant and they hold sway in the national economic order. Planning has been in decline, on the back foot, and it's been a very sad situation because when African countries started gaining independence, one of the important things each of them wanted to do was to plan their future. Planning was in its heyday. It was seen as the way every country should go, that you make a long-term plan and then you try and implement it, taking into account the vicissitudes of a nation's life. Unfortunately, we had this 40-year period when planning was discredited because it was seen as part of the Soviet era ideology, and people wanted to move towards market ideologies. And this became so fundamentalist that it became taboo to talk about planning. So at the National Development Planning Commission, when we decided on a 40-year plan, we were facing an uphill task, trying, one, to get the population on board, to get the public to see that just as humans plan their lives and large companies plan their future and so on, countries needed to go back to the fundamentals of planning. And we thought we did a very good job in getting the public on board because we had all these consultations and many members of the public talked about how they wanted to see Ghana in 40 years. And it was a very inspiring experience. At the same time, we were facing challenges from some of the political parties. And apart from them believing in the market, some of them also believed that a plan would hamper their freedom to fashion policies to run the country when they came to power, because as you know, every 4 years we have elections. So they felt that a plan could not last longer than 4 years. But we tried to convince them as well. And right now we've drafted a plan which we presented to the new government in power. They had not commissioned the plan, but they've received it. And it's left to be seen how they translate this plan into action. So I would say that was one of the most interesting challenges facing the Commission, how to move the population, but also political parties into a place where people could see the value of long-term planning.
Thanks, very interesting. So, in the beginning of the 21st century, for the first time, a woman was elected Chief of State in Africa. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf as President of Liberia. What this represents for the feminist fight in the continent?
It's a very interesting question you ask, and indeed you are right that for the first time a woman, Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, became President of Liberia. And I think she was followed soon after that by Joyce Banda, who, when a president died, became president as the vice president, but she since went on and lost elections. And so we still have only Ellen Sirleaf Johnson as a woman president, and she has had 2 terms, and in fact there are elections soon to be held in Liberia in which she's not standing, so we've come to the end of the Johnson term. Now, that was a very significant event in Africa, and I think it's similar in a way, maybe not as significant as Barack Obama coming to the presidency in the United States of America. What those occurrences do is to show that something is possible, that it's possible for somebody from a hitherto oppressed group to ascend to the highest levels of the presidency. But as dramatic as this is, we all know that it takes much more to change a society and to change a country's politics than to have a woman become a president. So there are many ways of looking at the Liberia story. We have to, for example, see what President Sirleaf Johnson actually achieved in her presidency in terms of changing gender relations in her country. Have the structures of power actually changed? Or we have the same male-dominated structures of power with one woman sitting on top of them? I suspect that it's the latter, that Liberia continues to be a male-dominated political system. And sadly, one person's presidency cannot change that. And I would not say that this is the failure of President Sirleaf Johnson, because gender inequalities are systemic and they are structural. They are not things that one individual can shift on their own. It would be a bit like Sisyphus moving the rock up the mountain and the rock rolling down and moving it up again. It takes a lot of doing, and there's pushback. There are men who do not want to see some of these changes. I think that the day when we can say that Africa has changed is when we stop remarking on the gender of the president. If we come to a place where a woman president is normal, there's nothing special about having a woman president, then we would say that the structures of power are actually changing, or that we have parliaments which are not dominated by one gender, or we have local authorities not dominated by one gender, and then we have households not dominated by one gender, and community leadership systems not dominated by one gender. Then we can see that power is really changing hands on our continent. And I think this is not only Africa's fight, it's probably a fight for the entire globe. I think Latin America has had many more women presidents than we have had the privilege to have. You had Dilma Rousseff here, and you had Bachelet in Chile, and obviously these are two fine women, and just like Sirleaf Johnson, but it will take much more to change the order, the gender order of our societies.
Okay, so this one is focused on international relations, so you can say based on your studies and what you think. I don't know. So what is your position about the future of international relations of the countries, mainly considering the China's rise, and in some theories, the possible decline of the United States? Yeah.
This is a very interesting question. I'm no expert on international relations, but looking at the global order, I think it's a good thing to have a multipolar world. And so the rise of China for someone like myself from a developing country, I think is welcome news. We need different poles of power to balance and check the powers of any one country. So this is welcome news. Having said that, I don't know if the power of the United States is declining. I think the United States moral authority might be in decline because the way America used to present itself as the land of the brave and free, the bastion of democracy and human rights and so on, I think has been shaken by many events that we see in the United States today, and the coming to power of President Trump being the last example of this development which leads people to question the United States moral authority. Having said this, I think the United States still remains the largest economy. We still live in a dollarized world in which all our transactions are influenced by the dollar. Some people say that the whole world subsidizes the American economy because of the sway of the dollar. The United States is still very dominant in NATO, in the UN, and the WTO, and so on. So I think the United States power is not on the wane, and it's maybe not for a few hundred years. I think scholars of international relations look at the long durée. So maybe this is the beginning of a decline. I don't know, and I can't tell. But in the world order in which we live in, the United States continues to be a very dominant power. And like I said, China's presence is a good thing. Having said that, it's also important to understand that countries have self-interest. China has its own self-interest, and as does America, as does countries in Europe and the whole European Union. And much of the time, these interests are not benign, and it's important in Africa for us to be cognizant of this. There are some people who see China as a savior of Africa. I think this is a dangerous view in which you replace one power with the other, because all these powers have their own interests. And I think what is really important is for Africa to begin to understand better what is going on in all these countries and with all these powers. And in the same way as many people study Africa in order to gain advantages in their relationship with Africa, Africa needs to begin to more self-consciously look very closely at the world powers and see what's happening. Happily, in my own university, we've instituted centers for European studies, for Latin American studies, for Asian studies in recent times. And I think this is a good development, because we've had an Institute of African Studies for about 50 years, which is also very good. But apart from studying Africa, I think it's a good thing for us to study other continents and what they are about and so on, in order to help us fashion in a knowledgeable world how Africa can navigate the coming multipolar world in which there are different powers. There are also, for example, the BRICS. Often we in the South see the rise of the BRICS as a very positive development for the South. But as you know, the South is not homogeneous. And increasingly, the transnational corporations that are trying to make money on the African continent come from the South. So there are Brazilian companies, there are companies from China and the Middle East and so on. So I think that also complicates the world order in which we live. And if we understand it better, maybe we can fashion out positions that support Africa's long-term development.
Okay, so the last. So what is, according to your view, the most important challenge facing global politics, and what should be the central debate in the discipline of international relations and political science, in your view?
That's one vast question.
Yeah, you can say about that.
I think the world faces a number of really serious challenges. One of them has to do with the theme of this conference, about the crisis of globalization. It is very clear that the global order as we know it is in huge crisis. You only have to look at the European Union, what's going on there, and Brexit, and the whole debt crisis in Greece and Spain and so on. You only have to look at the problems in the United States of America, and you only have to look at the economic crisis that many African countries are facing to see that the global order is in crisis. I think our biggest challenge is to fashion a new order in which many more can have some purchase, in which many more people, poor people, can realize themselves and gain self-determination, and also learn to do more than survive, but to actually thrive. We need a new global order. We need a global order which moves away from the market fundamentalisms of the last 30 years and begins a process of more self-consciously planning economies and societies, so that every part of the globe realizes what it needs. And we have a global order which is facing climate change and a crisis of climate. We've just seen all these hurricanes in this season. Some people say it's climate variability, there's nothing special about it. Many more people are noticing that there are clear ways in which humans are reshaping the climate to our disadvantage. So these are some of the big challenges we have to face. Last but not least, there's a crisis of insecurity and inequality. The world is becoming an even more unequal place. Inequalities between countries, within countries, between men and women, between workers and capitalists. But these inequalities have become a threat to our existence, and it's very important that countries begin to tackle them very seriously, however the problems manifest within the various countries. So those I think are some of the biggest challenges, and I do not know enough about international relations to know whether in our study of international relations we are focusing enough on these huge challenges, or whether we need a shift in international relations in a way that these issues become the issues that concern us in the world. So if you look at the last 30 years, there was a complete silence about issues like inequalities. Nobody seemed to be talking about them. There was more of an interest in talking about poverty, but less about inequality. But suddenly, there's a discussion on the streets among civil society groups and so on about inequalities. So it would be good if scholarship pays attention to what these inequalities mean. It would also allow us to deal with some of the paradoxes we face in the world today. So there are all these people who are talking about Africa rising, because they are saying that these days the African continent is a destination of investment, it's a preferred destination. People can make money on the African continent by speculating in land or investing in minerals and so on and so forth. And yet, Africa is also the country where so many poor people live. And Africa is a country which is giving Europe a lot of headaches about the migrations across the Mediterranean. What is it happening in Africa which is driving all these vibrant young people to risk their lives to cross the Mediterranean in flimsy boats and be fueling xenophobia in Europe and so on? So there's a lot going on in the world, which I hope that international relations will pay attention to and help us to fashion solutions to.
Okay, so do you want to answer?
Yeah, we have two more questions here.
Now they're professors themselves.
Yeah.
So you have written a book on the African feminism and the Black diaspora feminism. I would like you to tell us a little bit more. So what do you see the connections between the experience of, the political experience of African women, the African feminism, and the connection between African feminism and the feminism, the Black feminism in America, Brazil, United States. So
it's a very important question. It's a question which engages my attention a lot. And I'll tell you a little about how that book came about. We had a visitor from the University of Florida who came to visit us at the University of Ghana. At the time, I was at the Center for Gender Studies, and we were talking about a common project. And we just had this idea that wouldn't it be good to write a book about feminisms across the Atlantic? So that's where the title comes from, Transatlantic Feminisms. So we put out a call across the world asking for contributions to a book on transatlantic feminisms. And we're curious to see what would come through the door. And it was amazing what came. And I'll tell you a little story about one of the contributions. That's a tangential way of raising this issue about the things that women have in common across the Atlantic. One of the articles was about women, Haitian women, trading in second-hand clothing and crossing the Dominican border regularly and being treated as aliens, because if you cross a border, you become a visitor, and then you have to deal with the border police and all sorts of people. So the sense of alienation and struggle. And what were they trading in second-hand clothing? When I read that piece, I just stopped, because many women in Africa deal in second-hand clothing, And they are the foremost cross-border traders. They are the women who are always carrying goods across borders and having to navigate the very same experiences as those women, Haitian women crossing the border into the Dominican Republic. So I remember saying to this author that, can you look at the literature on cross-border trade in Africa? And she did so. And when the article came back, it was amazing the way the references to the lives of West African women in the same conditions got translated. So I would say that African women, black women in Latin America are African women. Many of them have African roots, and they are African women. And I think they face very similar experiences around the globe, wherever they find themselves, because they often are among the poorest of women, the ones struggling for survival, the ones who are least formally educated, and many of them are working in informal economies. And they are the ones who are doing most of the domestic work around the world, whether they are doing it in Africa or in Europe or in the Americas. Basically, they have very common experiences arising from the fact that they are the bottom of society. And at the same time, they are culturally similar in all sorts of ways. They look alike. People think of them in the way in which they think of black women everywhere, wherever they find themselves. They are the women that bleaching agents are peddled to make them fairer. They are the women who have to straighten their hair because to do that means that they look more like Western women and so on. So strangely very similar psychological, social, and economic experiences.
What are the common possibilities for us to work together, or the common challenges we face? You know that we are also creating an African Studies department here.
Yes,
you're aware of that. Yeah.
Yes, I'm aware that there's a cluster of African Studies scholars and students here in your university, and I think this is a very interesting development. I have not been intimately connected with the establishment of the Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Ghana, but I know it comes from a long-standing interest in Latin America, which is linked with the fact that we are all part of the Global South, but also because there are all sorts of historic links between African communities in Latin America and in Africa. You may know that in my own country, there's a Afro-Brazilian community somewhere in Accra. It's a group of people in Accra we call Tabon. I don't know what the name means, but they are identified as Afro-Brazilians, and they've settled in Accra. And a few people have been writing their history. In fact, when your ex-president Lula came to Ghana, he visited this community. And interestingly, the famous boxer Zuma Nelson, I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but he was a very famous featherweight champion of the world in his time. He comes from this Afro-Brazilian community. So this is a community which has provided a lot of research material to scholars, and I think they would like to extend that kind of study. And they also see very much the building of linkages with Latin American countries as a critical aspect of this. I think what we might be facing are some challenges to do with language, because much of the scholarship in Ghana is taking place in English. I know that the head of the center now is a Spanish scholar, so she's somebody who has studied Spanish, but much of the scholarship is taking place in English. And much of the scholarship here is written in Portuguese. So it's a challenge, but it's something that we should work hard to surmount. It may be that we could have some really interesting exchanges. If students from here, for example, would like to study English and African studies, Ghana is a very good place for them to come to, and vice versa. If our colleagues want to study Afro-Brazilian communities, whatever it is they want to study here, they probably could do a lot of exchanges. And who knows, we could even do joint studies of either way comparative studies. There are immense possibilities, I think. And so it would be interesting to talk a bit more about how we could take this kind of agenda forward. Because I think us understanding Latin America better is really vital for our own future.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks.